The laughter started before Elena Voss even sat down. She heard it behind her back, sharp and quick, the kind of laughter that people use when they want you to know you are being watched. She did not turn around. Her feet hurt too much to care who was watching. The ballroom had been full for 3 hours, and she had been standing near the wall for most of that time, holding a glass of lemonade that had gone warm in her hand. There was one empty chair left in the whole room. It was next to a man nobody wanted to sit beside. His name was Julian Ashworth, the Duke of Thornfield. Half of his face was marked by old burns, pulled tight and shining in the candlelight. He sat alone at the edge of the room, dressed better than any other man there and completely ignored by all of them. People glanced at him and looked away fast, the way you look away from something you feel guilty about noticing. Elena sat down next to him because her feet hurt, and there was nowhere else to sit. The laughter behind her grew louder. She did not look back to see who was laughing. She already knew. Her cousin, Charlotte Bennet, had spent the whole evening telling anyone who would listen that Elena had no dowry, no title, and no business being at a ball like this one. Charlotte had only brought her along because their aunt had insisted, and Charlotte had made sure everyone knew it was not her idea. The Duke did not look at Elena either. He kept his eyes on the dance floor, where couples turned in slow circles under the candlelight, and his jaw was set in the kind of stillness that comes from years of practice. "They will stop starring in a moment," he said, without turning his head. "They always do. There is only so long people can look at a ruined face before they get bored of it." Elena took a sip of her warm lemonade. "I was not looking at your face." "No. I was looking at the dance floor, same as you." She paused. "Though now that you mention it, the scar on your jaw is a very unusual shape, like a small river." Nobody had described his scar as anything other than a wound in 6 years. He turned his head just slightly and looked at her for the first time. She had a plain sort of face, the kind that did not announce itself in a crowded room, but her eyes were steady and her back was straight, and she did not flinch when he looked at her directly. "You are the vicar's daughter," he said, "Elena Voss. You know my name. I make it my business to know who sits beside me. It happens so rarely, I like to remember it." There was no bitterness in his voice, only a kind of dry amusement that surprised her. She had expected him to be cold, the way the rumors described him. Cold, silent, frightening to look at. Instead, he sounded like a man who had gotten very good at making jokes about his own loneliness, because the alternative was worse. "Why did you come tonight?" she asked, "if you knew no one would speak to you?" "My mother believes that if I stop appearing in public, people will start believing I am dead. She finds that inconvenient for the family name." He turned his glass slowly on the small table beside him. "Why did you come, if your cousin makes it so clear you are not wanted?" "Because my aunt asked me to, and I did not want to disappoint her." Elena looked out at the dancers again. "Also because staying home means listening to my father practice his sermons, and I have heard the one about patience so many times I could recite it in my sleep." For a moment the Duke almost smiled. It changed his whole face, pulling the burned skin in a way that made some men look away out of habit. Elena did not look away. She watched the smile happen and then fade, like she was memorizing something rare. "Most people," he said, "would have found a reason to move to another chair by now. Most people have more choices than one empty chair in a crowded room." She shrugged. "I am not being kind, Your Grace. I am simply tired, and this chair does not care what my dowry is." He laughed then, a short surprised sound like it had escaped before he could stop it. Several heads turned toward them. Elena heard the whispers pick up again, faster this time, sharper. She ignored them the same way she had been ignoring things all evening. "You should be careful," he said quietly, once the laughter had faded from his own face. "Sitting beside me is not free. People will talk about you for weeks." "People have talked about me before." She said it simply, without asking for pity, and something in her tone told him it was true. "I lost someone 2 years ago, a man I was to marry. After that, the talking did not frighten me anymore. It is only noise." He did not ask who. She did not offer more. The silence between them held something neither of them tried to fill, and for the first time that evening it did not feel uncomfortable. Across the room, Charlotte appeared at the edge of the dance floor, scanning the crowd until her eyes landed on Eleanor. Her expression sharpened into something close to alarm. "Eleanor," Charlotte's voice cut through the music as she crossed the floor quickly, her skirts rustling with every step. "There you are. Aunt Margaret is asking for you." It was not true. Eleanor could see the lie in the tight set of Charlotte's mouth, in the way her eyes kept flicking toward the Duke and then away, as if his presence alone might ruin something. Charlotte had brought Eleanor as a favor, and favors were meant to stay invisible, not sit beside dukes and make them laugh. Eleanor rose from the chair. Her legs were stiff from sitting after standing so long, and she wobbled for half a second before catching her balance on the edge of the small table. That was when the Duke held out his hand. He did not stand. He simply reached out, his palm open, steady, waiting for her to take it if she needed to. It was such a small gesture, the kind that happens 100 times a night in any crowded room, between any two strangers who happen to be near each other when someone stumbles. But nobody had offered Julian Ashworth their hand in 6 years. And now here he was, offering his to a woman with no dowry and a warm glass of lemonade, in front of everyone who had spent the evening pretending he did not exist. Eleanor looked at the offered hand. Then she looked at his face, at the scar shaped like a small river, at the eyes that had gone very still, as if he were bracing for her to refuse. She took his hand. It was warm and steadier than her own. She let it hold her weight for exactly the moment she needed to find her balance, and then she let go, the way you let go of any ordinary kindness. "Thank you," she said. He did not answer right away. Around them, the room had gone quieter than it should have been, the kind of quiet that means everyone is watching and pretending they are not. Charlotte stood frozen at the edge of the dance floor, her mouth slightly open, unsure what she had just witnessed. "You are welcome," the Duke finally said. His voice had lost its dry, careful edge. It sounded for just a moment like something closer to hope, though he would not have called it that himself. Eleanor followed her cousin across the ballroom, aware of every eye that turned to watch her go. She did not look back at the chair by the wall, though she wanted to. She could still feel the warmth of his hand against her palm, a small and ordinary thing that somehow did not feel small at all. Behind her, Julian Ashworth sat alone again, exactly as he had before she arrived. But something in the room had shifted, and he could feel it settling over him like a change in weather. For 6 years, he had made himself into a shadow at the edge of every gathering, a shape people glanced at and then forgot. Tonight, for the first time, someone had looked directly at him and stayed. He watched her walk away, her back straight, her steps sure despite the whispers following her like smoke. He did not know her well. He knew almost nothing about the man she had lost, or the sermons she had grown tired of hearing, or why she had chosen honesty over kindness when she spoke to him. But he knew he wanted to hear her voice again. Across the room, Charlotte pulled Eleanor toward a quiet corner, her grip tight on her cousin's arm. "What were you thinking?" she hissed. "Sitting there, talking to him. Do you have any idea what people will say?" "I imagine they will say a great many things," Eleanor answered calmly. "They usually do." "This is not a joke, Eleanor. The Duke of Thornfield does not receive guests. He does not attend dinners. He barely leaves his own house except for nights like this when his mother forces him. People will think you were trying to catch his attention on purpose." Eleanor glanced back toward the chair by the wall, where the Duke sat watching the dancers again. His face turned just enough that the candlelight caught the scarred side. He looked, she thought, exactly like a man who had spent 6 years waiting for someone to stop starring and start speaking instead. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "I was not trying to catch anyone's attention at all. Perhaps I only wanted somewhere to sit." Charlotte did not look convinced, but Alina was no longer listening to her cousin's warnings. She was thinking about the warmth of a hand held out without hesitation, and the way a man who had been laughed at for years had still found the courage, in that one small moment, to offer her his steadiness instead of his silence. The music started again, filling the room with movement and noise. Alina did not dance that night. She stood near the wall, exactly where she had stood before, and more than once, without quite meaning to, she found her eyes drifting back to the chair where the scarred Duke sat. He was looking at her too. Neither of them looked away. A week after the ball, a book arrived at the vicarage with no name attached to it. Alina found it sitting on the front step early in the morning, wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with string. Inside was a worn copy of a book about wildflowers, the kind of book that had clearly been read many times before, its spine soft and its pages marked here and there with small pencil notes in a narrow, careful hand. There was no letter, no card, nothing to say who had sent it or why. She turned the book over twice, looking for some clue, before her father called her in for breakfast, and she had no more time to wonder. By afternoon, the whole village seemed to know about the mysterious gift. Word traveled fast in a place where nothing much happened, and Alina found herself explaining the book to her father, to her aunt, and finally to Charlotte, who arrived at the vicarage that evening with an expression somewhere between curiosity and suspicion. "You must know who sent it," Charlotte said, turning the book over in her own hands as if she could shake the truth out of its pages. "Nobody sends an unsigned gift unless they want something." "Or unless they want nothing at all," Alina said. "Perhaps that is the point." "Nobody does anything for nothing, Alina. Not in this world." Charlotte set the book down carefully, then looked up with the sharp, knowing look she always wore when she believed she had solved something. "It must be Mr. Whitfield. He has been asking after you for weeks. He collects books, does he not?" Alina considered this. Edmund Whitfield was a pleasant enough young man who had spoken to her twice at church gatherings, mostly about the weather. She could not imagine him choosing a book about wildflowers, nor could she imagine him wrapping it so carefully, with string tied in a small, neat bow. "Perhaps," she said, though she did not believe it. That same evening, a carriage arrived outside the vicarage, sent, the driver explained, to take Miss Voss into the village whenever she required it, with no charge and no explanation attached. Alina's father, delighted by the unexpected convenience, thanked the driver warmly and asked whose kindness they had to credit. The driver only shook his head. He had been told not to say. Alina stood at the window that night, watching the empty carriage sit outside in the moonlight, and found herself thinking, without quite meaning to, of a man sitting alone at the edge of a ballroom, his hand held out steady and waiting. She dismissed the thought almost as soon as it arrived. Dukes did not send unsigned books about wildflowers. Dukes did not arrange quiet carriages for vicars' daughters they had spoken to only once. And yet the thought did not leave entirely. It stayed at the edges of her mind for days, the way a familiar tune stays with you long after the music has stopped. Charlotte, meanwhile, grew more convinced by the day that Edmund Whitfield was behind the gifts, and she began encouraging Alina toward him with an enthusiasm that felt less like kindness and more like relief. If Alina's attention could be directed safely toward a pleasant, ordinary young man, then whatever strange thing had happened at the ball could be forgotten, tucked away like an embarrassing story nobody needed to repeat. Alina let Charlotte believe what she wanted to believe. It was easier than arguing, and she was not entirely certain herself what she believed. 10 days after the ball, she encountered Edmund Whitfield at the market, buying ribbon for his sister. She thanked him for the book and the carriage, watching his face carefully as she spoke. His confusion was immediate and unmistakable. I am afraid I do not know what you mean, Miss Voss. I sent no book. I certainly did not arrange a carriage. I do not think I could afford to, if I am honest, not without my father noticing the expense. Elinor apologized for the misunderstanding, her mind already working through the puzzle again. If not Edmund, then who? She had not spoken to more than a handful of people at the ball, and fewer still had shown her any real attention. That evening she wrote a short letter, addressed simply to the Duke of Thornfield, and sent it before she could talk herself out of it. Your Grace, I have received a book about wildflowers and the use of a carriage, both without explanation. I do not wish to accuse you of anything, but I find I cannot stop wondering whether you know something about this mystery that I do not. If you do, I would be grateful for the truth, however inconvenient it may be. Elinor Voss. She did not expect a reply so quickly. It arrived the next morning, delivered by the same quiet carriage that had been sitting outside her home for days, and when she opened it, she recognized the same narrow, careful handwriting that had marked the pages of the wildflower book. Miss Voss, I confess, the book was mine before it became yours. I have carried it with me since I was a boy, back when I still walked in fields without thinking twice about who might be watching. I no longer walk in fields. I thought the book deserved someone who still could. The carriage was a small thing. You mentioned, in passing, that your feet were tired that night from standing so long. I did not think a woman who speaks so plainly should have to walk everywhere on aching feet simply because pride kept me from admitting the gift was mine. I did not sign either gift because I did not want you to feel obligated to thank a scarred man for small kindnesses. I see now that keeping silent only confused you, which was never my intention. I am sorry for that. If you would allow it, I would very much like to speak with you again. Not at a ball, where every word is watched and repeated by morning. Somewhere quieter, if such a place exists for either of us. Julian Ashworth. Elinor read the letter 3 times before she folded it and set it down on the small writing desk in her room. Her hands were not quite steady, though she could not have explained why. It was only a letter, only a book and a carriage and an apology delivered in careful, narrow handwriting. And yet something about the honesty of it, the plainness with which he admitted his own loneliness, moved her in a way she had not expected. She wrote back that same afternoon, suggesting the small garden behind the church, a place quiet enough that few people ever wandered through it, especially in the early evening when the light turned soft and gold. Charlotte, when she learned of the arrangement 2 days later, could hardly believe what she was hearing. The Duke, she said, her voice climbing higher with every word, the Duke of Thornfield sent you gifts in secret, and now you mean to meet him, alone, in a garden. It is hardly scandalous, Charlotte. It is a garden behind a church. It is scandalous precisely because it is secret, Elinor. Do you not understand what people will say if this becomes known? A dowryless vicar's daughter, meeting privately with a duke who has not received a single visitor in years. They will say you are trying to trap him. They will say far worse things than that if I am honest, and none of it will matter that it is untrue. Elinor considered her cousin's warning carefully. She was not foolish, and she understood exactly how quickly a story could spread through a village that had little else to occupy its attention. But she also thought of the man sitting alone at the edge of a crowded ballroom, offering his hand to a stranger simply because she needed somewhere steady to hold, and she found she could not make herself regret the choice she had already made. I will be careful, she said, but I will still go. Charlotte left the vicarage that evening with her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line, and Elinor spent the rest of the night staring at her own reflection in the small mirror above her wash basin, wondering what exactly she hoped to find in a quiet garden with a man the whole county had already decided to fear. The evening of their meeting arrived gray and still, the kind of light that makes every shadow seem softer than it truly is. Elinor walked to the church garden alone, her shawl pulled tight against the evening chill, her heart beating faster than the short walk should have caused. The Duke was already there when she arrived, standing near a small stone bench beneath an old oak tree, his hands folded behind his back in the stiff posture of a man unused to waiting for anyone. When he saw her approaching, something in his shoulders eased just slightly, the way tension leaves a rope once the strain is finally released. "You came," he said. "You sound surprised." "I am always surprised, Miss Voss, when people do exactly what they say they will do. It happens so rarely in my experience that I have stopped expecting it." Alina sat down on the stone bench, and after a moment's hesitation, he sat beside her, leaving a careful, respectable distance between them. The garden was quiet except for the soft rustle of leaves overhead and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere beyond the church wall. "Thank you for the book," she said. "It was kind of you, though I do wish you had signed it. It would have saved me a great deal of confusion, and poor Mr. Whitfield an accusation he did not deserve." The Duke's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I did consider signing it. I decided against it in the end because I did not want you to accept the gift out of politeness alone. I wanted to know whether you would keep it because you wanted it, not because a title asked you to. And now that you know, I sent a letter demanding the truth, rather than simply thanking you politely and moving on. What have you learned?" "That you are exactly as plain-spoken as I hoped you would be." This time the smile did appear, brief and real. "It is a rare thing, Miss Voss. Most people speak to me as though I might shatter if they say the wrong word. You speak to me as though I am simply a man sitting beside you." "You are simply a man sitting beside me." "Not to most of the county." Alina looked at him then, really looked, the way she had at the ball, without the flinch or the polite glance away that most people offered him instead. The scar along his jaw caught the last of the evening light, pale and uneven against the rest of his face. "May I ask what happened?" she said quietly. "Or is that a question too far for a garden bench and a single meeting?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might refuse to answer at all. "There was a fire," he finally said. "6 years ago. My brother did not survive it. I did, though there were nights afterward when I wished it had gone the other way." He said it simply, without asking for comfort, the same plain and steady way she had once told him about the man she lost. "I do not speak of it often. I find most people want the story shortened into something they can nod at and forget. You, I think, would let it sit as long as it needed to." Alina did not reach for his hand, though she wanted to. She only nodded, letting the silence hold the weight of what he had shared, without rushing to fill it with comfort he had not asked for. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Thank you for asking as though you actually wanted to know." They sat together as the light faded further, talking of smaller things after that. Books he had read as a boy. The sermon her father had given the week before, the one about patience that she had heard so many times she could recite it in her sleep. It was an ordinary conversation, unremarkable in almost every way, and yet Alina could not remember the last time she had felt so completely at ease in another person's company. When the evening finally grew too dark to stay longer, the Duke walked her partway home, staying carefully out of sight of any windows that might report the sighting by morning. At the corner where their paths needed to separate, he stopped and turned to face her. "May I write to you again?" he asked, "properly signed this time." "I would like that," Alina said, "though I imagine Charlotte will have a great deal to say about it." "Charlotte," the Duke said, with the faintest trace of dry humor returning to his voice, "does not strike me as a woman whose opinion troubles you greatly." Alina laughed, a short surprised sound very much like the one he had made at the ball. "No," she admitted, "it does not." She walked the rest of the way home alone, the evening air cool against her face, and found herself smiling in a way she had not smiled in a very long time. Behind her, in the fading light, Julian Ashworth stood watching until she disappeared safely around the corner, before turning back toward the quiet house that had felt, for 6 long years, like the only place in the world that would ever want him. Tonight, for the first time, it felt like somewhere he was simply waiting to return from. Letters passed between the vicarage and Thornfield Hall for the better part of a month, each one signed properly now, each one a little longer than the last. Alina kept them tied together with a length of blue ribbon in the bottom drawer of her writing desk, though she would not have admitted to anyone how often she took them out simply to read again. Julian wrote about the estate, about tenants he had spent years avoiding and had only recently begun visiting again. He wrote about his mother, the Dowager Duchess, a sharp-tongued woman named Beatrice who had spent 6 years quietly grieving 2 sons instead of 1, though only one of them had died in the fire. Alina wrote back about her father's endless sermons, about the wildflower book she now kept on her nightstand, about small village disputes that seemed enormous until you realized how little they mattered outside the boundaries of one street. It was Beatrice, in the end, who arranged their next meeting properly, insisting that if her son intended to keep exchanging letters with a young woman, he might as well invite her to walk the estate gardens like a civilized person, rather than skulking about church benches after dark like something out of a Gothic novel. Alina arrived at Thornfield Hall on a bright afternoon in early autumn, the leaves just beginning to turn at the edges, gold bleeding slowly into green. The house itself was larger than she had imagined, gray stone rising 3 stories against a pale sky, though there was something unlived in about it, certain windows shuttered, certain wings clearly closed off and forgotten. Beatrice met her at the door herself, a small, sharp-eyed woman with silver hair pinned severely back, who looked Alina over with the kind of assessment that made most young women straighten their spines out of instinct. "So you are the vicar's daughter," Beatrice said, "who sat beside my son when nobody else would." "I only sat where the chair was empty, Your Grace." Beatrice's mouth curved, not quite a smile, though something close to approval flickered behind her sharp eyes. "That is precisely what he told me you would say. Come in, then. He is somewhere in the garden, pretending he is not waiting for you, though he has changed his coat twice this morning." Alina found Julian near the far end of the garden, standing beside a stone fountain that had clearly not run water in years, its basin dry and filled instead with fallen leaves. He turned when he heard her footsteps on the gravel path, and for a moment, before he composed himself, she caught the same unguarded relief she had seen the night of the ball, the look of a man who had spent so long expecting disappointment that hope still surprised him every time it appeared. "You changed your coat," she said, without meaning to sound as amused as she did. "My mother has a talkative mouth and no sense of privacy." He glanced back toward the house, where Beatrice had already retreated inside, though not without one final glance over her shoulder. "I hope she was not too fearsome." "I liked her," Alina said honestly. "She reminds me of my aunt, if my aunt had inherited an estate instead of a modest cottage and a great deal of opinions about needlework." They walked the garden path slowly, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders, and Julian told her, piece by piece, about the estate as it had been before the fire. There had been dinners here once, he said, gatherings that filled every room with noise and light. His brother Henry had been the one who loved that kind of company, who could fill a silent room simply by walking into it. Julian had always preferred quieter corners, but he had never minded the noise, because it meant Henry was happy. "After the fire," he said, "the house grew very quiet very quickly. I found I did not mind that either. At first, it seemed fitting somehow that the silence should match how I felt inside." Alina listened without interrupting, letting the words come at whatever pace he chose to give them. She had learned over their letters that pushing him toward faster answers only made him retreat further into careful, guarded sentences. Patience, she had discovered, was the only door that opened easily. "You do not have to tell me more than you wish to," she said, when he fell silent again. "I know." He looked at her, something steady and searching in his expression. "That is precisely why I find myself wanting to tell you more." They stopped near a low stone wall at the edge of the garden, where the manicured paths gave way to a wilder stretch of meadow beyond the estate's boundary. Wildflowers grew there in loose, uneven clusters, the same kind pressed carefully between the pages of the book he had once given her. "My brother used to bring flowers from that meadow for our mother," Julian said. "Every week, without fail. He said a house full of grief needed something alive in it, or the grief would win eventually." He looked out at the meadow for a long moment. "I have not picked a single flower from that field in 6 years." Elinor watched him carefully, and before she quite decided to do it, she reached out and touched the scarred side of his jaw. Gently, the way you might touch something you were afraid could break, though her intention was only tenderness. He flinched. It was not a small flinch. His whole body went rigid, his breath catching hard in his throat, and for one terrible moment his eyes were not looking at her at all, but at something years away, something that still had the power to pull him backward without warning. His hand shot up and caught her wrist, not roughly, but with a grip that spoke of pure instinct rather than thought. Then just as quickly he seemed to catch himself. He released her wrist immediately, stepping back half a pace, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder rather than on her face. "I am sorry," he said, his voice rough. "I did not mean to grab you like that." "You do not need to apologize." Elinor kept her voice steady, though her heart was pounding hard against her ribs. "I should not have touched you without asking. That was thoughtless of me." "It's not that." He pressed the heel of his hand briefly against his eyes, a gesture she suspected he was not even aware of making. "The fire started with a candle too close to a curtain in my study. Henry came in to pull me away from the flames before they reached the desk where I was working. He is the one who caught fire first, trying to get me clear of it." He said the words fast now, almost mechanically, as though speed could get him through them before the memory caught up. "I remember his hands on my shoulders, pushing me toward the door. I remember the exact moment his hand stopped moving." Elinor did not reach for him again. She stood very still, letting the silence hold what he had just given her, resisting every instinct that told her to fill the space with comfort he had not asked for. "I was thrown back 5 years just now," he said quietly, almost to himself. "A single touch, and I am 11 years old again, watching my brother's hands go still against my shoulders." "You do not have to explain further," Elinor said. "I am not asking you to make sense of it for me." He looked at her then, something raw and unguarded in his expression, the careful composure he wore in every ballroom, and every letter stripped away entirely. "Most people, upon learning that, would decide I am not fit company for quiet gardens or careful conversation." "I am not most people, Your Grace. I believe we established that at the ball." Something in his shoulders eased, not all the way, but enough. He did not apologize again, and she did not ask him to. They simply stood together at the edge of the wild meadow, the wind moving gently through the tall grass, and let the moment settle into something neither of them tried to resolve. After a while he spoke again, his voice steadier now. "You have never told me about the man you lost." Elinor looked out at the meadow, choosing her words carefully, the way she had watched him do with his own memories. "His name was Edward. He gave me a pocket watch before he left to visit his family in the north, the winter before we were meant to marry. He died of fever before he could return it, or rather, before I could return it to him. I still carry it, though it stopped keeping time years ago." "You do not have to explain further," Julian said, echoing her own words back to her gently. "No," she agreed, "I do not." They stood together a while longer, saying little else, until the afternoon light began to slant lower through the trees and Elinor knew she needed to start for home before her father grew concerned. Julian walked her to the edge of the estate grounds, and at the gate he stopped, his hand resting briefly on the old iron latch. "Thank you," he said, "for not looking at me the way people usually do after they learn something like that about me." "How do people usually look at you?" "Like I am something broken that needs careful handling, or something dangerous that needs to be watched." He shook his head slightly. "You looked at me the same way you did at the ball, like I was simply a man standing beside you." "You are simply a man standing beside me," Alina said again, the same words she had offered him weeks before, and this time they seemed to land somewhere deeper than they had the first time. She left him standing at the gate, the wildflowers swaying gently in the meadow behind him, and walked home with the pocket watch heavy in her pocket, thinking of hands that stopped moving and hands that reached out anyway, despite everything they had once been taught to fear. 3 days later, a second letter arrived from Thornfield Hall, shorter than the others, written in handwriting slightly less careful than usual, as though it had been written quickly, before second thoughts could interfere. "Miss Voss, I have thought of little else since our walk in the garden. I find myself wanting to tell you things I have not spoken aloud to another living person in 6 years, and I confess this frightens me more than the fire itself ever did. I do not know what to call what is happening between us. I only know that I would very much like it to continue, if you are willing. Julian." Alina read the letter standing at her window, the evening light fading slowly over the rooftops of the village, and found that her hands, for once, were not steady at all. She thought of the pocket watch in her drawer, stopped forever at whatever hour it had last been wound, and of a man who had spent 6 years learning to stop his own heart from reaching toward anything that might be taken away again. She wrote back that same night, her answer short and certain. "I am willing." She did not know yet what waited for them both beyond the quiet garden and the careful letters. She did not know that Charlotte's jealousy had already begun curdling into something sharper, something that would soon reach far beyond whispered gossip at a ball. But standing at her window with his letter still warm in her hands, Alina allowed herself, for the first time in 2 long years, to want something without immediately bracing herself for the loss of it. Outside, the last light faded from the sky, and somewhere across the fields, in a house that had been too quiet for far too long, Julian Ashworth sat by his own window, holding her answer, and let himself hope in a way he had almost forgotten how to do. The rumor began, as most damaging rumors do, with a grain of truth twisted just enough to sound believable. Charlotte had seen the ribbon-tied letters in Alina's desk drawer one afternoon while borrowing a shawl, and though she had not read a single word inside them, she had counted them, had noted the careful blue ribbon, had noticed how many there were for a friendship that had supposedly begun only weeks earlier. By the time she left the vicarage that day, a story had already begun forming in her mind, one that made sense of her own quiet resentment far better than the truth ever could. Within a week, the story had a shape. Alina Voss, it was whispered at the market and over tea in every parlor that mattered, had been writing to the Duke of Thornfield in secret for months, filling his head with sympathy and soft words, all so that a penniless vicar's daughter might secure herself a title and a fortune she had done nothing to earn. Some versions of the story claimed she had engineered the entire meeting at the ball. Others claimed she had known about his scars beforehand and had planned her kindness accordingly, calculating exactly how touched a lonely, wounded man might be by attention nobody else was willing to give him. Alina heard the first version from the butcher's wife, who delivered it with poorly disguised delight while wrapping a cut of mutton. She heard the second from a woman at church, who offered it up between polite inquiries about her father's health, as though the 2 topics belonged naturally together. By the time she returned home that afternoon, her hands were shaking, though not from fear. It had been a long time since anger had risen in her so completely, so fast. She confronted Charlotte that same evening, finding her cousin in the small parlor of her aunt's house, embroidering a handkerchief with careful, unbothered stitches, as though she had not just set fire to 2 people's lives with nothing but idle talk. "You told them I planned it," Alina said, not bothering with any greeting first. "You told them I calculated his loneliness like a merchant counting coins." Charlotte did not look up from her stitching. "I told them what made sense, Alina. What else was I to think? You disappear for hours at a time. You receive gifts from a man who has not left his own house in 6 years for anyone else. What was I supposed to believe, that it was simply friendship? You are supposed to believe the truth because you know me. You have known me since we were children. I know the Alina who had nothing, Charlotte said, finally lifting her eyes, something sharp and unhappy flashing behind them. I do not know who you have become since a duke started sending you carriages. Alina stood very still, understanding for the first time that this was never truly about the letters or the ribbon, or the number of times she had visited Thornfield Hall. This was about years of quiet resentment finally finding somewhere to land. Charlotte had always had more, and had always seemed in her own quiet way, unhappy despite it, watching Alina move through the world with a kind of steadiness Charlotte herself had never managed to find. I am sorry, Alina said quietly, that you have decided the worst version of me is easier to believe than the truth, but I will not apologize for something I did not do. She left her aunt's house before Charlotte could answer, walking home through streets that felt different now, colder, watched. Neighbors who had once nodded politely now glanced away as she passed, or worse, did not look away at all, studying her with open curiosity, as though trying to spot the calculation the rumors insisted must be hiding somewhere beneath her plain, familiar face. At Thornfield Hall, the story reached Julian 2 days later, delivered by his mother with the careful, measured tone Beatrice used only when she was preparing to say something he would not want to hear. They are saying she trapped you, Beatrice said, setting down her teacup with more force than necessary. That she knew exactly how to use your loneliness against you. I do not believe a word of it, for what that is worth, but you should know what is being said before it reaches you from someone less kind than I am. Julian sat very still, a familiar tightness spreading through his chest, the old instinct rising fast and automatic. Retreat. Withdraw. Let the doors close again, the shutters go up over the unused wings. Let the quiet swallow everything before it could be taken from him a second time. It had worked for 6 years. It was the only thing that had ever truly worked. But beneath the instinct to disappear, something else stirred too, something unfamiliar and hot, and it took him a moment to recognize it as anger. Not the quiet, controlled anger he sometimes allowed himself over small estate matters, disputes with tenants or careless staff. This was sharper, steadier, a feeling that rose through him and settled into something almost like relief, the way a familiar tool feels in a hand that has forgotten, over years of disuse, how good it feels to hold something solid. They are wrong, he said. I know that, Julian. They are wrong, and I intend to make sure everyone who repeats that story understands exactly how wrong they are. He stood, his chair scraping back hard against the floor. I have spent 6 years letting people believe whatever they wanted about me, because it was easier than correcting them, because retreating always felt safer than standing in a room and being looked at. I will not let them do the same thing to her. Beatrice studied her son for a long moment, something that might have been pride flickering behind her sharp eyes. What do you intend to do? I intend to attend the Whitmore Assembly this Friday, publicly, with Miss Voss beside me if she will still have me after everything this county has already put her through. You have not attended an assembly in 6 years. No, Julian agreed, I have not. He wrote to Alina that same afternoon, his hand steadier than it had been in years, the anger burning clean and useful beneath every careful word. Miss Voss, I have heard what is being said, and I understand if it has made you wish to distance yourself from me, if only to protect what remains of your own reputation. I would not blame you for choosing silence and safety over further scrutiny. But if you are willing, I would like to attend the Whitmore Assembly this Friday, and I would like you to attend it with me openly, so that anyone still repeating that story might see for themselves exactly how untrue it is. I have spent 6 years hiding from rooms full of people who stare. I find, quite suddenly, that I no longer wish to hide from anything, least of all from standing beside you where everyone can see. Julian. Alina read the letter twice, sitting alone in her room while the sounds of her father's evening sermon practice drifted faintly through the wall. She thought of Charlotte's sharp, unhappy eyes, of the butcher's wife wrapping mutton with poorly disguised delight, of every careful glance that had followed her through the village that week. She thought, too, of a hand held out steady in a crowded ballroom, and a man who had just told her, in his own careful way, that he had chosen to stop hiding. She wrote back before she could talk herself into caution. I will come, let them look. The Whitmore assembly, when Friday finally arrived, was crowded and bright, candles blazing in every corner of the ballroom, the same kind of gathering where the original story had first taken root weeks before. Alina arrived with her aunt, her chin lifted despite the tight knot of nerves in her stomach, and felt the room's attention shift toward her almost immediately, the whispers rising fast and low, the way they always did whenever she entered a room these days. Julian arrived 20 minutes later. He walked through the entrance without hesitation, without the careful, guarded posture he had worn at every gathering for 6 years, straight toward the corner of the room where Alina stood beside her aunt. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone is watching and pretending they are not, exactly as it had the night of the ball, except this time the silence carried something different in it, something closer to disbelief. He stopped in front of Alina and bowed, formal and correct, in full view of everyone. Miss Voss, he said, loud enough for the nearest onlookers to hear clearly, I understand there has been some discussion recently about the nature of our acquaintance. Alina kept her chin steady, though her heart was pounding. I understand there has been a great deal of discussion, Your Grace. Then allow me to correct the record publicly, since it seems the private truth has not traveled quite as far as the private gossip. He turned slightly, addressing not only Alina but the small crowd that had gathered close enough to listen without appearing to. Miss Voss did not seek my attention. I sought hers, the night of the Hartley ball, when she sat beside me without flinching, in a room full of people who had spent 6 years pretending I did not exist. She has asked me for nothing since. Not money, not title, not favor of any kind. She has only ever offered honesty, which I have found, in 6 years of silence, to be considerably rarer than anything else this county has to give. A murmur moved through the crowd, uncertain, shifting. Somewhere near the edge of the room, Alina saw Charlotte standing frozen, her face pale, her earlier certainty crumbling visibly under the weight of a duke's public correction. If anyone in this room continues to believe otherwise, Julian continued, his voice steady, the anger beneath it controlled now, purposeful rather than wild, I would ask that they take the matter up with me directly, rather than repeating it in market stalls and church pews where Miss Voss cannot defend herself. Nobody in the crowd spoke, nobody, it seemed, was quite prepared to argue with a duke standing in the middle of a ballroom, plainly and publicly claiming a woman most of them had spent weeks dismissing. Julian turned back to Alina, and for a moment the careful correctness of his public speech softened into something more private, meant only for her. I hope that was not too much. It was exactly enough, Alina said, and found to her own surprise that she was smiling. He offered her his arm, and this time when she took it, there was no hesitation in the gesture at all, no calculation, nothing but two people choosing, quite deliberately, to be seen together in a room that had spent weeks insisting they should not be. Across the ballroom, Charlotte slipped quietly toward the door, her earlier triumph gone entirely, replaced by something that looked, for the first time in years, uncomfortably close to shame. Alina did not go after her. There would be time later, perhaps, for whatever conversation still needed to happen between them. Tonight was not for that. Tonight was for standing in the middle of a crowded room, on the arm of a man who had finally stopped hiding, and letting everyone see exactly what the truth looked like, without a single whisper left to argue against it. Spring came slowly to the county that year, the way it always did, though to Alina it felt as though the whole world had shifted overnight, the frost lifting all at once from fields that had seemed permanently gray only weeks before. 6 months had passed since the Whitmore assembly. The rumors Charlotte had once spread through market stalls and church pews had faded into the background of village life, replaced eventually by newer, less interesting stories, the way gossip always eventually gives way to the next thing. Charlotte herself had not spoken to Alina since that night, though Alina had heard, second-hand, that her cousin had grown quieter in the months since, less certain of herself, as though the collapse of one story had left her without quite enough material to build the next. Alina did not think of Charlotte often anymore. There was too much else filling her days. She had visited Thornfield Hall more times than she could easily count since that spring evening in the wild meadow, watching slowly as the house itself seemed to wake from a long sleep. Beatrice had taken to inviting small gatherings again, nothing large, nothing overwhelming, but enough that laughter had begun returning to rooms that had stood silent for 6 years. Julian still flinched sometimes, at unexpected touches, at certain sounds, at the particular smell of smoke drifting from a kitchen chimney on a still evening. Alina had learned not to rush past those moments, and not to smother them with too much comfort either. She simply stayed steady, until whatever memory had risen finally settled again. He had learned, in turn, to reach for her hand instead of retreating from it, which was, she thought, its own kind of quiet miracle. It was Beatrice, in the end, who insisted on the second ball. 6 years he refused to dance, she told Alina over tea one afternoon in early spring, her sharp eyes softened by something close to sentiment, though she would never have admitted to feeling it. I do not intend to let him wait a 7th. The Hartley family, delighted at the prospect of hosting an event that promised to be the talk of the season regardless of what actually happened at it, agreed readily to hold the ball in the very same ballroom where Alina had once sat beside a scarred stranger, simply because her feet hurt too much to stand any longer. Alina arrived on the appointed evening in a gown the color of pale gold, her hair arranged more carefully than it had been that first night, though she found, standing at the edge of the same crowded room, that her nerves felt remarkably similar to how they had felt 6 months earlier. The same candlelight, the same low hum of conversation and music, the same watchful eyes, though this time they turned toward her with curiosity rather than dismissal. She did not need to search for an empty chair this time. She stood near the edge of the dance floor, watching couples turn slowly beneath the light, and waited. Julian crossed the room himself. There was no hesitation in his steps this time, no careful avoidance of the crowd, no lingering near the shadowed edges where he might go unnoticed. He walked directly through the middle of the room, past guests who turned to watch him pass, past whispers that had shifted, over the months, from cruelty into something closer to fascination, and stopped in front of Alina with the same steady stillness she remembered from the night they first met. "I believe," he said, "that I owe you a dance. I do not recall you promising me one, Your Grace." "No," he admitted. "I did not think 6 months ago that I would ever dance again, but I find myself considering it now, provided the lady beside me is willing to overlook a somewhat rusty partner." Alina smiled and held out her hand before he could offer his. He took it. The room seemed to hold its breath as they moved onto the floor together, the same room that had once watched her sit beside him in near silence, now watching him lead her into the center of everything, in full view of every candle and every whisper the county had ever produced about either of them. The music began, and for a moment, Julian's steps were careful, almost hesitant, the movements of a man remembering something he had not practiced in years. Then something in his shoulders eased, the same easing she had seen the very first time she took his offered hand, and he settled into the rhythm of the dance as though his body had simply been waiting, all this time, for permission to remember how. "You are smiling," Alina said. I am attempting not to step on your feet, which I understand requires a great deal of concentration after 6 years of practice. You are doing remarkably well for a man so out of practice. I have had excellent motivation, he said quietly, his eyes steady on hers, to relearn how to stand in a crowded room without wanting to disappear from it. They turned slowly beneath the candlelight, and for the length of that single dance, the whispers around them seemed to fade into something distant and unimportant background noise beneath the far louder sound of two people who had found, against every expectation either of them once carried, something steady enough to hold on to. When the music finally ended, Julian did not release her hand right away. He stood with her in the middle of the floor, other couples moving around them, and reached into his coat pocket, producing something small that caught the candlelight as he held it out to her. It was not a ring, though several nearby guests audibly gasped, clearly expecting exactly that. It was a small pressed wildflower, carefully preserved beneath a thin sheet of glass, set into a simple silver frame small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. I picked it myself, he said, from the meadow behind the estate, the first flower I have picked from that field in 7 years. Alina took the small frame carefully, turning it over in her hands, feeling the weight of exactly what it meant, a gesture that carried far more inside it than the size of the object could ever suggest. Your brother used to bring flowers from that meadow. He did. Julian's voice was steady, though something soft moved behind his eyes. I think he would like knowing the meadow is finally being visited again. Alina closed her hand gently around the small frame, and for a moment neither of them said anything else at all, the silence between them carrying everything that still did not need explaining. Around them, the ballroom continued its usual noise and movement, but here, in the middle of the floor, something quieter and far more permanent had settled into place. "Thank you," she said finally, "for holding out your hand that first night, when everyone else in this room had already decided where I was not welcome to sit." "Thank you," Julian answered, "for taking it, when every sensible person in this room would have told you not to." He drew her hand gently through his arm, and together they walked toward the edge of the ballroom, past guests who no longer bothered whispering behind their hands, past a room that had once laughed at the sight of them sitting together and now watched instead with something closer to quiet respect. Near the far wall, in the same spot where a lonely, scarred duke had once sat entirely alone, 2 empty chairs stood side by side, waiting for no one in particular. Alina glanced at them as they passed, thinking of warm lemonade and a stranger's steady hand, of wildflower books and unsigned letters, of a rupture in a quiet garden that had never fully healed but had slowly learned how to be carried instead of hidden. She did not need the chairs tonight. Tonight, she had somewhere better to be, walking arm in arm through a room that had finally run out of things to laugh about, beside a man who had spent 6 long years learning how to disappear, and had chosen, instead, in the end, to be seen.